much, Sumi, and sorry to all of you that I can't be with you. It's needless to say, an interesting time to be talking about mobility when so many of us are immobile in various ways. And I confess that in these circumstances, a day trip to Berlin feels like a Caribbean cruise. As it is, it's another Zoom presentation. Hooray! Exciting. I am sat in my house. I've got a street sweeping truck going up and down in the road. I've got a dog who's recovering from an operation and feeling a bit sorry for himself. The children are looking for their school uniforms. Anything might happen. So I hope it all goes smoothly. I'm a social scientist at University College London. I run a project called Driverless Futures, which is looking at how we can understand the excitement about self-driving cars and how policymakers can make good decisions about them when they are a technology that is still a work in progress. So let me start with a story, and it's a story that begins in 2007. Some suitably grainy news footage here. This is at a disused airbase in California. This is the third Grand Challenge event run by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It is a competition in which teams of researchers from around the US came together to attempt something extraordinary, which was to have computers navigate complex environments, in this case, driving around a city. You'll see there some mishaps, the occasional crash, but that story of heroic failure is part of the journey that innovation has been on to get to what you see there, which is cars achieving something remarkable, which is the navigation of open environments. The winners of that competition, Stanford and Carnegie Mellon universities, the scientists there went on to populate some of the startups that would go on to develop the prototype self-driving cars. It's remarkably recent, and yet we have rapidly gone from a situation in which a self-driving car seemed impossible to now having self-driving cars that seem inevitable. Here is a presentation that the chief executive of NVIDIA did. NVIDIA are a chip maker. This is a presentation at the CES show in Las Vegas. And what you can see there is a claim that not only is self-driving cars the most interesting test case for machine learning, artificial intelligence, but also that if we get this right, we will solve a number of social problems. Like a lot of tech, this is a solution in search of a problem. When it comes to mobility and driving, the problem presented itself quite easily, and the dominant justification for self-driving cars is one of human error. Humans are terrible drivers. They get drunk, they get distracted, they get old. So the story goes, if we can take out the human, drop in an infallible computer, we can, if we follow the estimates from consultants, save hundreds of thousands of lives, cut the number of cars in our cities by maybe 3/4. We can get rid of parking. We can gain trillions of dollars in economic benefits. And with all of this, there's a race to see which companies, which countries can make the technology work first. If you head to YouTube, you can find videos like this. This is from Tesla, and this is showing you the tech in action. It's not just showing you what the tech does, it's also claiming to show you what the tech sees. So on the right-hand side there, you'll see this is artificial intelligence in action. You have some relatively simple sensors, cameras in this case, seeing the world, classifying the objects in the world, predicting what those objects are going to do next, and planning safe paths through those objects in hugely complex environments. Right, this includes not just other cars, but also, joggers, cyclists. The weather isn't great, so this is showing artificial intelligence, a bravura performance of artificial intelligence. And this story, we've probably all heard a version of this story. And it's remarkable, and we should be excited by it, but we shouldn't be seduced by it, because it's certainly not the whole truth. There's a lot that isn't shown in these videos, and if we swallow this story, we could end up making some bad decisions. The first point is that the technology has a much longer and more complicated history than just going back to 2007 and the recent excitement about artificial intelligence. This film is a lovely film from General Motors in 1956, from their Motorama exhibition. And you can see the vision of the future here. I mean, it's a gorgeous vision of the future. And as with lots of these visions of the future, oddly, the social roles are still preserved in aspic. You still have the men in the front of the car smoking the cigars, the women in the back. But technologically, the vision of the future is quite an interesting one. What you can see there is not just a smart car, it's a smart road. Right? This is from a time when the US was much more enthusiastic about infrastructure, when the vision of the future on offer was one of a whole ecosystem, not just an intelligent software, not just the car able to drive itself, but an intelligent highway. And this history should make us remember that much of what needs to happen with new mobility in general and with self-driving cars in particular is beyond the control of tech companies. It requires more than just getting the artificial intelligence right. Perhaps the first challenge that we're already seeing as companies start to try and test the technology on public roads is what engineers would call edge cases. Here's a video, this went viral a few years ago in London, showing an extraordinary everyday reaction as filmed from the head cam of a motorcyclist, right? The sort of negotiation that we see all the time in eye contact, in hand gestures. Driving is not like other achievements of artificial intelligence. Driving is not chess. Getting this sort of negotiation right requires really careful thought about the rules of the road, who should be where, what would we expect of one another, and is it okay to just leave that in the hands of artificial intelligence? Now, self-driving cars are a technology that doesn't yet exist, but there are robots in real environments that do exist. There's a nice example, and social scientists have written about this. This is the Roomba, the robot vacuum cleaner. And it displays a form of intelligence as it goes about its job of vacuuming carpets. But for the robot to work as advertised, it takes substantial human work, not just working out how the robot should relate to, in this case, dogs, but also how the people that own the robots need to organize their lives in order to make their environments what they call Roomba-izable. Right? They need so there have been social studies that have found that people need to, for example, lift up wires from the floor, otherwise the robot will choke on them. They need to move or get rid of furniture so that the robot can work in their environment. It's a small example, but if we're thinking about what self-driving cars might mean in our world, it's the sort of example that I think is going to be hugely important. It takes work to make the world machine readable. Right? The world is not just machine readable in the way that we as humans with our eyes can currently interpret road signs and environments and all of the complexities. Right? It is absurd to assume that artificial intelligence will be able to do all of that. And in places where self-driving cars have started to be tested, we've already seen, for example, extensive efforts at mapping, some efforts at installing smart infrastructures, and we can expect more of that. We can expect more upgrades to the world, and we can expect there to be more pressure to upgrade the world in order to meet the expectations of a new technology. So we need to think about what a good transition will look like. And I'll just end on this point. If we don't think carefully, we could fail to realise the opportunities of this new technology, and we could also risk exacerbating our dependence upon cars. This video here is from San Francisco just before the big earthquake, and it shows a whole collection of different transport modes. This was just at the dawn, the birth of the motor car, and actually this video is in part an advert for the motor cars that you see coming in front of this camera, which is attached to a cable car. What happened after this in many American cities was the reorganization of American roads to suit one form of technology, and that form was the motor car. We didn't just see the redesign of streets, the tearing up of public transit systems. We also saw changing the rules of the road to suit cars and to create a new category of pedestrian, the jaywalker. The jaywalker who would not be allowed to be in the road, right? This sort of this chaotic shared space became an organized space. What we're likely to see in different places, in different ways, is the reorganization of our roads to suit particular technologies, which means being skeptical about the claims of those technologies. We can't just assume that the technology is inevitable. The real question is not when self-driving cars will arrive, but where, in what form, and for what purposes. The myth of the autonomous vehicle operating on its own with some sort of preordained logic is a really bad guide for policy. So my suggestion would be, rather than starting with a tech-based story, that we instead need to start with people's needs and ask what those really mean. That sounds obvious, but it's often forgotten in discussions of new technology and society. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack, for that very entertaining and also informative presentation. You know, I'm curious, moments of crisis like the one that we're in right now often pave the way for technological transformation. That means we're ready to accept changes that otherwise we might not be. So what do you think that means for mobility in terms of the COVID-19 crisis?
I think it's really interesting. So a crisis, I think you're absolutely right. You can crises disrupt our assumptions. They can accelerate things that were happening anyway. They can also allow for the possibility of new things to happen that seemed impossible. And I think we're seeing it in cities. We're seeing it in cities already, that there are, you know, people in support of, for example, self-driving cars are saying, well, surely this is our time, right? At a time at which people are looking for social distance, robots would seem to have found their purpose. But also the technology is not ready. And so we've seen, you know, self-driving car testing operations actually shut down in these moments rather than extend. I think more interesting, perhaps, is the sort of experiments that this crisis has enabled in things like the redistribution of road space. Now, that creates political battles about things, you know, should we be pedestrianising central London, for example, at a time at which people are perhaps more dependent on their cars because public transport becomes riskier. But what we see is that a lot of taken for granted assumptions about what the future of mobility looks like are suddenly thrown up in the air. And to be honest, anything could happen. And it's a time when, you know, despite the pressure, we need to take careful, measured decisions, not rushed ones.
And I want to ask you about something you pointed out, you know, that Roomba that we saw in your presentation. There are aspects in our lives where we are willing to bring robots, automated systems into our lives. What do you think that is about human behavior that we will have to address to be able to bring automation into larger parts of our society, particularly mobility on our roads and our streets?
Yeah, well, I think it's a negotiation, right? I think, you know, we know, even though the claim of artificial intelligence is that the technology will adapt to our lives, we know that when we have a new technology, inevitably we have to adapt as well as the technology adapting. It's a conversation between users, citizens, and technology, which isn't to say, oh, well, we shouldn't do it then. It's to say, well, we should have an open conversation about what we do want to see. If the technology needs us to change our behavior, right? If it needs pedestrians to become more predictable, then we should be honest about that.
All right, well, you certainly have gotten our conversation here started, Jack. Thank you so much to you there in London. And don't go very far, because we're going to bring you back in just a little bit for a panel discussion. Jack Stilgoe.
Thank you.
Thank you.